The first time the HOA president tried to land her authority on my helipad, she did it with a clipboard in one hand and a smile so confident it felt illegal. I was standing next to a running turbine when she told me I was obligated to share the airspace, and for a split second I honestly wondered if the jet wash had scrambled her brain. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a normal neighborhood dispute. This was going to end with paperwork, sirens, and someone learning the difference between property lines and federal law the hard way. The helicopter had just lifted off, the noise still vibrating in my ribs, when I noticed the small crowd gathering near the perimeter fence. Neighbors. Phones out. The usual HOA spectators who loved drama as long as it didn't splash onto their lawns. My helipad sat on the far edge of my property, poured concrete, proper markings, windsock snapping cleanly in the afternoon air. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't theoretical. It existed because my work required it, and because I'd gone through every permit, inspection, and soul-draining approval process to make it legal. That was what made her approach so surreal. She didn't wait for the rotors to fully spool down. She marched right up to the safety line like she was crossing a supermarket aisle, heels clicking, clipboard tucked against her chest. The confidence wasn't loud. It was worse. It was calm, practiced, rehearsed. She told me the HOA board had voted. She said the word voted like it carried the weight of a court order. According to her, my helipad was now a shared community resource. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not a polite laugh. A sharp one that escaped on instinct. The kind that gets you looks from people who think you're about to lose it. She didn't laugh back. She explained, patiently, that since my property was within HOA visual range and helicopters were loud and disruptive, it was only fair that residents be allowed to benefit from the inconvenience. Emergency landings, recreational flights. A local real estate agent had even suggested it would increase neighborhood value if buyers knew they had aviation access. I stared at her, then at the helipad, then back at her clipboard, waiting for the punchline that never came. I told her no. One word. Calm. Flat. No explanation. Her smile tightened. She flipped a page like this was a routine step she'd practiced in a mirror. She said refusal would result in fines. Daily fines. Escalating fines. Possible lien discussions. She said it casually, like she was offering a weather forecast. I told her she might want to step back behind the safety line. That was when her tone changed. She informed me that the HOA did not recognize private aviation exclusivity. She said airspace was public. She said concrete was concrete. She said the board had authority over structures that affect the community atmosphere. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear. Clarity. I asked her, slowly, if she had any idea who regulated helipads. She waved a hand like I'd brought up a minor technicality. She said she'd already spoken to people in aviation. She didn't say who. She didn't need to. In her world, proximity to authority was the same as authority itself. Behind her, two neighbors nodded. One of them mouthed the word wow like I was the unreasonable one. I walked to the edge of the pad and shut down the remaining systems, taking my time. When I turned back, she was already explaining how residents could schedule landing times through the HOA portal. She'd thought this through. Calendars. Liability waivers written by someone who clearly had never seen a turbine blade up close. She even had a suggested fee structure that would offset maintenance. I told her again that the answer was no, and that if anyone attempted to land here without authorization, I would treat it as trespass. She snapped her clipboard shut. She said, very clearly, that the HOA would be contacting the aviation authorities to resolve my misunderstanding. That almost made me smile. The following week was a parade of escalation disguised as bureaucracy. Letters slid under my door. Emails marked urgent. A notice taped to my gate announcing a pending compliance review. They cited noise complaints that hadn't existed before. They referenced safety concerns from people who had never stood within 50 feet of a helicopter in their lives. Then came the real stunt. I came home one afternoon to find orange cones near my helipad and a laminated sign zip-tied to my fence. Community Landing Zone. Approved by HOA board. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at it, feeling the kind of disbelief that makes the world feel slightly unreal. Someone had crossed from delusion into action. That line, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. I removed the sign. I removed the cones. I documented everything. That night, I filed a formal complaint with the Aviation Authority. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just facts. Permits. Coordinates. Photos. Copies of HOA communications where they claimed jurisdiction they absolutely did not have. The response came faster than I expected. An inspection was scheduled. The HOA found out before I could even enjoy the silence. The president showed up again, this time with 2 board members and a man in a blazer who introduced himself as risk management. They stood just outside my gate, talking loudly about community safety and shared resources, clearly performing for the neighbors watching from across the street. I told them an inspection was coming. I suggested they reconsider their position. The man in the blazer smiled thinly and said inspections could be clarified. That was the moment I knew exactly how this would end. The day of the inspection, the Aviation Authority arrived in marked vehicles. Real ones. Not clipboards. Not laminated signs. Professionals who measured distances, reviewed permits, and asked precise questions. They barely acknowledged the HOA group hovering nearby. I answered everything. Calmly. Confidently. The inspector asked me one final question before leaving. He asked if anyone had attempted to assert control over the helipad without authorization. I handed him the folder. As they drove away, the HOA president finally stopped smiling. That was just the beginning. By the next morning, the HOA acted like the inspection had never happened. No emails. No notices. No dramatic posts on the community board. Just silence so thick it felt deliberate, like they were holding their breath and hoping reality would blink first. I knew better. Silence from people like that wasn't surrender. It was planning. I was halfway through a call when I heard engines. Not helicopters. SUVs. Multiple. I looked out toward the road and watched 3 HOA vehicles roll up like they were arriving at a catered event. The president stepped out first, sunglasses on, posture perfect. 2 board members followed, and behind them, the same man in the blazer, now holding a leather folder like it contained commandments. They didn't come to the gate this time. They stood just outside my fence, positioned so anyone driving past would see them. Performance again. Optics. Always optics. She called my name like we were old friends. I walked out slowly, phone in hand, recording without making a show of it. She noticed immediately. Her jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before the smile came back. She congratulated me on the inspection. Said it was productive. Said the board appreciated my cooperation. Then she pivoted so hard I almost admired it. She explained that the HOA had decided to formalize helipad usage rather than dispute ownership. She said they were proposing a memorandum of understanding. A temporary agreement. Shared access during emergencies and scheduled community event. I told her there would be no agreement. The man in the blazer stepped forward. He said this wasn't about ownership anymore. He said this was about liability. He said if a helicopter ever needed to land here in an emergency and I refused access, I could be exposed. I asked him who would be piloting these hypothetical helicopters. He didn't answer. One of the board members chimed in about disaster preparedness. Another mentioned medical evacuations. None of them could explain why a residential HOA needed aviation infrastructure when the nearest hospital helipad was 5 minutes away and fully operational. They spoke like they'd rehearsed, each line cleanly handed off to the next, like a bad stage play. I told them emergency landings were already covered by federal law. I told them any licensed pilot could land here in a genuine emergency without permission. I told them the difference between emergency access and scheduled community usage was not a gray area. The president crossed her arms. She said the Aviation Authority hadn't explicitly told them they couldn't coordinate usage. I corrected her. They hadn't explicitly told her she could. That's when she lost patience. She said the HOA would be installing signage. Official signage. She said they would be publishing helipad availability hours. She said if I interfered, fines would resume. I laughed again. Quieter this time. Almost disappointed. I told her any sign placed on my property would be removed. Any attempt to manage access would be documented. Any further communication should be routed through legal counsel. She leaned closer to the fence and lowered her voice. She said, very calmly, that she didn't appreciate being embarrassed. There it was. The real motive, finally exposed. Not safety. Not value. Ego. I reminded her she'd done that herself. They left without another word, but the performance wasn't over. That evening, the community forum lit up. Posts about selfishness. About refusing to help neighbors. About someone thinking they were above the rules. No names, but everyone knew. Someone commented that helicopters attracted attention. Someone else suggested property values were at risk. A third implied I was hiding something. The following day, a drone appeared. It hovered near the helipad, just outside the fence line, camera pointed directly at the markings. I watched it from the porch, waited until it drifted lower, then waved. It jerked back like it had been startled. I called the Aviation Authority again. This time, I included screenshots from the forum and a still frame of the drone. The response wasn't polite anymore. Another inspection was scheduled. This one came with enforcement officers. The HOA didn't know that yet. They did know, however, that their pressure campaign wasn't working. So they escalated sideways. A letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. It accused me of operating a nuisance structure. It cited noise ordinances that didn't apply. It claimed my helipad created exclusive access to communal sky. I read it twice, then forwarded it to the Aviation Authority and my own counsel. 3 days later, the enforcement vehicles arrived. They parked directly in front of my property, blocking half the street. 2 officials stepped out, followed by a uniformed officer. The HOA president appeared within minutes, like she'd been waiting behind a curtain. She smiled when she saw the vehicles. I didn't. The lead enforcement officer asked me to walk them through the property. He didn't look at the HOA group once. He focused on the pad, the markings, the documentation I already had ready. The president tried to interject. She tried to explain community concerns. She tried to frame herself as cooperative. The officer finally turned to her and asked a single question. Who authorized you to represent this helipad as a community asset? She hesitated. Just long enough. She said the HOA board had assumed authority. The officer asked if that assumption was documented anywhere in federal or state filings. Silence. He told her assumptions didn't override aviation law. He told her signage, scheduling, and drone surveillance constituted interference. He told her any further attempts to control or market the helipad would be considered a violation. Her face changed. Not anger, fear. Before leaving, the officer asked if anyone had attempted to land or schedule landings without permission. I told him not yet. He nodded and said, quietly, let us know if that changes. That should have ended it. But people like her don't stop when they're told they're wrong. They stop when it costs them something. And she was just getting started. The cost started small, almost petty, the way people like her prefer it at first. The HOA didn't challenge the enforcement notice directly. That would have required admitting they were wrong. Instead, they went after everything around the helipad like termites chewing the frame instead of the beam. Parking violations for vehicles that had been there for years. Landscaping notices claiming my grass height was inconsistent with community aesthetic. A warning about exterior lighting that had somehow become aviation adjacent. It was harassment dressed up as procedure. I documented everything: date, photos, copies. Every notice went into the same expanding folder that already had its own weight and smell, paper and toner and entitlement layered together. What I didn't expect was how quickly they'd try to make it public. The HOA president started telling people that the Aviation Authority was reviewing concerns. She never mentioned enforcement. She never mentioned violations. Just review. Uncertainty. Doubt. She framed it like the outcome was still up in the air, like maybe the community would win if everyone applied enough pressure. Neighbors stopped waving. Some started watching instead. I caught people slowing down as they drove past, eyes flicking toward the helipad, like they expected something dramatic to be happening at all times. Then someone tried to book it. I didn't find out through an email or a request. I found out when my phone buzzed with a flight notification I didn't recognize. A light utility helicopter had filed a landing inquiry using coordinates that matched my pad exactly. No prior contact. No authorization. I made one call. The pilot answered immediately, confused but professional. He said he'd been told the landing site was available for scheduled use and that the HOA had confirmed access. He forwarded me the message while we were still on the line. It was from the HOA president. Not vague. Not implied. Direct. She had told him the helipad was community managed and cleared for use during daylight hours. I told him not to land. He apologized twice and diverted without argument. Then I forwarded everything to enforcement. The response this time was immediate and sharp. They asked if I wanted to pursue it formally. I said yes. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. I didn't plan to attend, but my attorney suggested visibility mattered. So I went. I sat in the back, quiet, while the president ran through the agenda like nothing was wrong. Budget items, pool maintenance, fence repairs, normalcy theater. Then public comments opened. A neighbor stood up and asked about the helicopter that hadn't landed. Another asked why there were rumors about federal involvement. Someone else asked if the helipad was safe. The president smiled and said discussions were ongoing. That's when enforcement walked in. 2 officers. No rush. No drama. Just presence. The room shifted immediately. Chairs creaked. Whispers cut off mid-sentence. They asked for the president by name. She stood up slowly, still smiling, still performing. She said she was happy to cooperate. They asked her to step outside. The meeting dissolved into murmurs the moment the door closed behind them. I stayed seated. I didn't need to hear what was said. I already knew how it would go. She came back 10 minutes later without the smile. She adjourned the meeting early. No explanation. No eye contact. People filed out buzzing with questions she didn't answer. The next day, a notice went out to the entire community. Not from the HOA. From enforcement. It clarified, in plain language, that the helipad was privately owned, federally regulated, and not subject to HOA control. It stated that any representation to the contrary was false. It warned that further interference could result in penalties. The HOA president didn't send emails for 3 days after that. On the 4th day, she showed up at my gate alone. No clipboard. No blazer. No audience. She asked if we could talk. I considered it longer than she expected. Then I opened the gate and stepped outside, leaving it open behind me. A small thing, but it mattered. She apologized. Sort of. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said she'd misunderstood the scope of her authority. She said she was under pressure from residents. I listened without interrupting. Then she asked if we could find a way to move forward peacefully. I told her peace required boundaries. I told her there would be no shared use, no coordination, no involvement. I told her the HOA was to stay away from the helipad entirely. She nodded too quickly. She asked if I would consider withdrawing the formal complaint. I told her no. That's when her tone changed again. Not aggressive. Defensive. She said enforcement action would hurt the community. She said fines could affect HOA finances. She said people would blame me. I told her people could blame whoever lied to pilot. She left without another word. A week later, the penalties were announced. The HOA was fined for misrepresentation and interference. Not catastrophic, but enough to sting. Enough to show up in the budget. Enough to require explanation. The president resigned the following evening. The board appointed an interim replacement and issued a carefully worded statement about leadership transitions and learning experiences. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. Because entitlement doesn't always die when the leader falls. Sometimes it just looks for a quieter way in. And someone else on that board had been taking note. The interim president introduced himself with a handshake and an apology letter. He showed up 2 days after the resignation, alone, no entourage, no clipboard. Middle-aged, careful posture, the kind of man who spoke softly because he'd learned that volume invited consequences. He said he wanted to reset the relationship between the HOA and resident. He said transparency mattered. He said he'd reviewed what happened and agreed mistakes were made. I listened, nodded, let him finish. Then he asked if the helipad could be discussed at the next board meeting so everyone could move on. I told him no. He blinked, surprised, then smiled like he'd expected resistance. He said not discussion of access, just discussion of coexistence, noise mitigation, communication protocols, courtesy notifications. I told him the helipad was not an HOA topic. The smile faded slightly, but he stayed polite. He thanked me for my time and left. For a week, nothing happened. No notices. No posts. No vehicles idling outside my gate. The quiet felt earned, like the calm after a storm when you finally unclench your shoulders. Then a survey appeared in everyone's inbox. Official HOA branding. Neutral wording. Harmless on the surface. Questions about community priorities. Safety concerns. Amenities residents valued. Buried halfway down was one that made my jaw tighten. Would you support relocating aviation activity to a shared, community-managed space? They weren't talking about relocation. They were talking about leverage. I forwarded the survey to enforcement and my attorney. Both responded with the same message, phrased differently. They're testing boundaries again. This time I didn't wait. I sent a single, formal notice to the HOA board. It stated clearly that any attempt to include my helipad, aviation activity, or property in surveys, planning discussions, or proposals would be documented as continued interference. It cited prior enforcement warnings. It was calm, factual, and unmistakable. The interim president replied within the hour. He apologized. Said the survey was automated. Said the question was poorly phrased. Promised it wouldn't happen again. 2 days later, a contractor truck showed up near the edge of the neighborhood. They weren't on my property. They were on the narrow strip of land just outside it, where the HOA owned a utility easement. They unloaded equipment. Surveying gear. I walked out and asked what they were doing. The foreman said they were marking boundaries for a potential noise mitigation barrier. I asked who ordered it. He gave me the HOA's name. I asked if they had permits. He said that wasn't his department. I made another call. Enforcement arrived faster than the contractors expected. The officers reviewed plans, asked questions, measured distances. They shut the work down before the first stake could go in. The interim president arrived just in time to watch. He didn't argue. He didn't smile. He looked tired. He pulled me aside and said the board was under pressure. Residents wanted reassurance. They wanted control. They wanted something tangible to point to. I told him control wasn't theirs to have. He asked what it would take to make this stop. I told him to put it in writing. A formal resolution acknowledging the helipad was not under HOA jurisdiction, that no future action, survey, or mitigation effort would involve it. He hesitated. Long enough to matter. That hesitation told me everything. The resolution passed a week later, narrowly. They circulated it quietly. No announcement. No apology. Just a PDF buried in meeting minute. I thought maybe that was enough. Then the insurance letters started going out. Homeowners received notices stating that aviation activity nearby could affect premiums. That proximity to non-community managed helipads carried risk. That residents might want to review coverage options. It wasn't an order. It was a nudge. I got a call from a neighbor I barely knew. She asked if I planned to expand operations. Another asked if flights would increase. Someone else asked if I could limit weekends. That was when it clicked. The HOA had stopped fighting directly. Now they were letting fear do the work. I requested a formal meeting with enforcement and invited the HOA board to attend. They didn't expect that. The meeting was held in a neutral office, fluorescent lights and long tables, no audience, no theatrics. Enforcement laid out the history, the misrepresentation, the interference, the fines, the warnings. Then they addressed the insurance issue. They stated, clearly, that there was no increased risk beyond what had already been permitted. That any suggestion otherwise was misleading. That continuing to spread uncertainty could be considered indirect interference. The board members shifted in their seat. The interim president stared at the table. Enforcement asked if there had been any recent attempts to influence perception or access. No one answered. I spoke instead. I said this had gone far beyond a misunderstanding. I said it was now a pattern. I said I wanted assurances. The enforcement officer nodded and said those could be arranged. When the meeting ended, the board members left quickly, avoiding eye contact. The interim president stayed behind. He said he thought he could manage the situation. I told him it wasn't his anymore. Because while the board had been busy nudging and implying and surveying, enforcement had been busy too. And they were done asking nicely. Someone on that board had crossed one line too many. The consequences were already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or flashing light. They arrived as envelopes, thick ones, official ones, the kind that make people nervous before they even open them. Every board member received one. So did the HOA's management company. So did their insurance provider. Enforcement had expanded the scope, and they didn't bother hiding it. This wasn't about the helipad anymore. It was about a pattern of overreach. I found out the same way everyone else did. Through whispers. The community forum went quiet overnight. Not locked. Not moderated. Just silent. No posts. No arguments. No passive-aggressive polls. People were reading instead of talking. The interim president called me that afternoon. His voice was tight. Controlled. He asked if I knew what was happening. I told him I had a general idea. He said enforcement was requesting records, communications, board votes, internal messages related to the helipad and associated pressure strategies. He didn't use those words by accident. Someone had already told him what enforcement was looking for. He asked if I planned to cooperate. I told him I already had. That night, a neighbor knocked on my door. Same woman who'd asked about insurance earlier. She looked uncomfortable, like she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She said the HOA had encouraged residents to document helicopter activity, times, durations, noise levels. She said they'd framed it as safety feedback. I asked if she'd participated. She shook her head. She said she hadn't realized what it was for until now. I thanked her for telling me. The next day, enforcement followed up with her. And then with others. The board tried to get ahead of it. They sent out a message about transparency and cooperation, about working with authorities, about protecting the community. What they didn't mention was that enforcement had already flagged internal communications. Someone on the board had suggested using insurance pressure to force voluntary compliance. Another had talked about making the helipad more trouble than it's worth. It wasn't speculation. It was written down. The interim president resigned before the week was over. The management company issued a statement distancing itself. The HOA's attorney stopped returning calls. At that point, I expected relief. Instead, I got escalation. One evening, as the sun was dropping and the windsock hung limp, I heard the sound I'd been dreading. Not the deep, controlled thrum of a turbine I recognized, but the uneven chop of something unfamiliar. I stepped outside and looked up. A helicopter was circling low. Too low. It made one pass, then another, drifting toward my property line like it was testing the idea of landing. I grabbed my phone and started recording. The pilot came on the radio frequency. He sounded uncertain. He said he'd been told the site was available for a demonstration flight. He said the HOA had cleared it. I told him to abort immediately. He hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Enforcement was already on standby. I'd learned not to wait anymore. I reported the attempted landing in real time, sent the video, sent the message the pilot forwarded me. The helicopter pulled away. The response this time was not procedural. It was decisive. Enforcement contacted the pilot's company directly. They opened a formal case. They requested records of who had authorized the flight and why. The HOA president was gone. The interim president was gone. But the emails traced back to a remaining board member who had thought staying quiet meant staying safe. He resigned within hours. The board was dissolved by the end of the week. A temporary administrator was appointed. External. No ties to the neighborhood. No patience for drama. The administrator contacted me personally. She apologized without qualifiers. She said she'd reviewed everything. She said the helipad issue was closed permanently. Then she asked if there was anything else enforcement should know. I thought about it. About the surveys, the insurance letters, the pressure, the attempted landing. I told her everything. 2 days later, enforcement announced additional penalties for coordinated interference and misrepresentation. The HOA's insurance premiums spiked. The management contract was terminated. The neighborhood finally went quiet for real this time. No posts. No rumors. No clipboard visits. I stood on the helipad one afternoon, wind back in the sock, sun low on the horizon, and let myself breathe. I thought it was over. I was wrong again. Because while the HOA structure had collapsed, entitlement doesn't need a board. It just needs one person who thinks rules don't apply to them. And one of them hadn't learned a thing. The person who hadn't learned a thing lived 3 houses down. I didn't know that at first. All I knew was that someone was still watching. It started with small things. A car idling a little too long near the fence. A phone held up, then quickly lowered when I looked back. Someone standing on their driveway pretending to check mail while staring straight past the mailbox. The HOA was gone, the board dissolved, enforcement satisfied, but the attention hadn't faded. It had narrowed. The first direct sign came as a note taped to my gate. No letterhead. No signature. Just neat handwriting and a tone that tried very hard to sound reasonable. It said the neighborhood was still concerned. It said helicopters made people nervous. It said not everyone felt safe with aviation activity so close to their homes. It suggested I consider the community, now that the HOA couldn't intervene. I took a photo of the note and removed it. The next day, another one appeared. This one less polite. It accused me of showing off. It said the helipad was excessive. It implied I was compensating for something. I didn't respond. 2 nights later, my security system alerted me to motion near the pad just after midnight. I pulled up the feed and watched a figure move along the fence line, keeping low, flashlight sweeping across the concrete markings. I saved the footage. The following afternoon, I finally saw him clearly. Middle-aged. Confident walk. HOA energy without the badge. He approached my driveway like he belonged there and stopped just short of the gate. He introduced himself by first name only. Said he was speaking as a neighbor. Said he'd lived here a long time. Said the helipad was still a problem. I asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted assurance. Assurance that flights would be limited. Assurance that nothing would expand. Assurance that the neighborhood wouldn't become an airstrip. I told him I wasn't giving assurances. He smiled tightly and said he figured I'd say that. Then he said he had friends. He said not everyone needed a board to make noise. He said there were other ways to make something uncomfortable. That was the first time I felt anger instead of disbelief. I told him any further contact should go through my attorney. I told him trespassing or harassment would be documented. He shrugged and said he was just talking. That evening, the complaints started again. Not from the HOA. From individuals. Calls to the city about noise. Messages to enforcement asking for clarification. Someone even contacted a local news station asking about unregulated private helipads in residential zones. Enforcement called me before the reporter did. They asked if anything had changed operationally. It hadn't. They asked if anyone had approached me directly. I sent them the footage. The next morning, an officer knocked on his door. I watched from my window as they spoke. I watched his posture change. I watched his confidence drain away in stages, like air from a punctured tire. He came back that afternoon. This time, he didn't smile. He apologized. Quickly. Poorly. He said he hadn't realized the seriousness. He said he thought enforcement was done. I told him it wasn't. He asked if I planned to press charges. I told him I planned to protect my property. That was enough. The notes stopped. The late-night walks stopped. The calls tapered off. A week passed without incident. Then 2 more. The neighborhood settled into a new normal, quieter than before, more cautious. People waved again. Some avoided eye contact. A few apologized in passing without saying what for. Enforcement closed the last open file and sent confirmation in writing. I framed that one. By the time summer edged toward fall, the helipad had become what it was always meant to be. A tool. A piece of infrastructure. Nothing more. No audience. No drama. I thought about how far it had gone. How something so concrete, so clearly regulated, had become a battleground for ego and entitlement. How many people had convinced themselves that wanting something badly enough made it theirs. One evening, as a helicopter lifted off smoothly into a clear sky, I noticed something different. No phones. No watchers. Just wind, sound, and distance. That was the moment I knew it was almost over. But entitlement always leaves a final bill. And the last one hadn't been paid yet. The bill arrived as a subpoena. Not mine. The neighborhood's. It landed quietly, without announcement, the way real consequences tend to. Enforcement had closed its operational files, but a separate arm had been reviewing everything from a different angle. Not aviation. Governance. Misrepresentation. Liability exposure created by unauthorized claims and actions. People don't realize how far paper trails travel once they exist. A notice went out to homeowners requesting cooperation in a civil review. Voluntary interviews. Optional statements. Clarification of who knew what and when. No accusations yet. Just questions. That was enough to rattle everyone. The same neighbors who had once whispered about noise and insurance now whispered about liability and assessments. Conversations shifted from helicopters to legal fees. From control to distance. Nobody wanted their name attached to anything anymore. The temporary administrator scheduled a town hall. Neutral location. No branding. No board table. Just folding chairs and a microphone that squealed when it was first turned on. I didn't plan to speak. I sat near the back, unnoticed, listening. The administrator explained the scope of the review. She explained that enforcement actions had triggered mandatory disclosures to insurers and lenders. She explained that misrepresenting property control carried consequences not just for leadership, but for organizations as a whole. Someone asked if homeowners were at risk. She answered honestly. Only if they'd participated knowingly. The room went very still. Another resident stood up and asked if the helipad issue was finally finished. The administrator looked directly at me before answering. She said yes. Completely. Permanently. She said there would be no future attempts to regulate, restrict, or incorporate private aviation infrastructure into HOA activities. She said it was now documented, acknowledged, and closed. Then she added something unexpected. She said the community owed someone an apology. No one clapped. No one spoke. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, embarrassed, aware that silence itself was an answer. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me. Quietly. Awkwardly. One thanked me for standing firm. Another admitted they'd believed things that weren't true. Someone else just nodded like that was all they could manage. I accepted it all without comment. The final twist came from the insurer. The HOA's policy had been restructured. Premiums adjusted. Coverage narrowed. A clause added that specifically excluded claims arising from unauthorized representations of private property or infrastructure. That clause had a name. Everyone knew what it referred to. The temporary administrator resigned a month later. Her job done. The HOA limped forward under strict oversight, stripped of ambition, reduced to basics. Trash schedules, pool maintenance, fence paint colors. Power, once taken away, rarely returns in the same shape. On a clear morning, weeks later, I walked the helipad before a scheduled departure. Inspections done. Systems checked. Everything where it belonged. I paused at the edge and looked out over the neighborhood. No signs. No cones. No surveys. No eyes. Just houses. Lawns. Distance. I thought about how easily it could have gone another way. How close it had come to becoming something uglier, louder, more dangerous. All because a few people couldn't accept that some things weren't theirs to manage. The helicopter arrived on time. Professional, clean, controlled. As it lifted, I felt none of the old tension. No anticipation of conflict. No readiness to document or defend. Just motion. Just purpose. I didn't know it yet, but that flight would be the last one anyone questioned. The final chapter wasn't about enforcement or fines or authority. It was about something entitlement hates more than anything else. Irrelevance. The last bill didn't come in the mail. It came months later, quietly, when nobody was watching anymore. By then, the neighborhood had settled into a version of itself that felt smaller, safer, less ambitious. The HOA existed, but only on paper and necessity. No committees, no initiatives, no grand visions about shared resources. Just dues, repairs, and reminders to take trash bins in on time. People learned to mind their own property again. So did I. The helipad became invisible in the way only fully accepted things do. It didn't draw attention because it no longer needed to. Flights came and went without commentary. No one flinched at the sound. No one pretended it was a threat. It was just part of the landscape like a road or a roof. Then one afternoon, a certified letter arrived addressed to the HOA. Someone left it at my gate by mistake. I recognized the sender immediately. A law firm I'd seen before, attached to the insurer. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I forwarded it unopened to the administrator's office and went back inside. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was a neighbor. One of the early skeptics. He sounded nervous. He asked if I'd heard what was happening. I said I hadn't. He told me one of the former board members had filed a claim. Not against me. Against the HOA. Wrongful resignation. Personal liability exposure. Emotional distress. He believed he'd been misled about authority and protections. He thought the HOA would cover him. They wouldn't. The exclusions everyone had ignored were now very real. The insurer denied coverage. The HOA couldn't indemnify. The former board member was on his own. The lawsuit didn't go far. It didn't need to. It did its damage just by existing. Legal fees mounted. Depositions were scheduled. Old emails resurfaced. Words that had once felt casual now carried weight. Other former board members received notices as potential witnesses. Some of them called each other for the first time in months. That was the final cost. Not fines. Not enforcement. Not penalties. Time. Money. Stress. Reputation. All because a few people had convinced themselves that authority was something you could declare instead of earn. I never got dragged into it. Not once. My name appeared only as context. A fixed point. Something they'd tried to move and failed. When it finally ended, there was no announcement. No apology tour. Just quiet resolutions and checks written where pride used to be. A year after the first clipboard showed up at my fence, I stood on the helipad alone. No engines. No crew. Just wind and concrete and distance. I thought about how absurd it had all been. How quickly entitlement turns into entitlement's shadow, the part that refuses to let go even when the rules are clear. How dangerous confidence becomes when it's divorced from reality. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. The helipad wasn't a symbol anymore. It wasn't a battleground. It was just mine, as it had always been. The HOA never mentioned it again. They never could, because the Aviation Authority hadn't just shut them down. They'd erased the illusion that it was ever theirs to control. And once that illusion was gone, there was nothing left to fight.